to your computer.
Yes, excellent. And then
I turn the volume down, David.
Grant, if anyone else comes into a waiting room, you can still manage that then, can you?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep, perfect.
I should be able to, yeah.
Right.
I think I'm still the co-host.
Light on it. That little echo.
All right, so we might get everyone to mute their lines up. In fact, I might do that here myself. And then you can...
Got it.
Oh, where have I gone? All right, beautiful. And okay. All right, I'll start, and then if anyone else pops in, then they can. Thank you for jumping online tonight. One of the things that I promised that I would do before I headed out on my trip was make sure that I gave back a little bit to people that have been helping support my climb just by getting online and hosting a webinar and sharing a little bit about it. I don't actually know what a webinar technically is, so this might not actually be a webinar, but it's just a chance for me to talk a little bit more about the climb that I'm going on and some of the sort of whys and hows, and answer a few questions that over the last year, as I've been building up towards finding myself going to Mount Everest, I've been sent different questions as people have followed along on my journey. And so I thought I would jump online and have a chance to actually share a bit more and let people ask other questions if they'd like as I go through it. I've got a presentation that I will talk through a little bit, if I can do okay with my screen sharing. And then once I've gone through that, I'll put that back off and I'll then answer any more questions. So while I go through that, keep your microphones muted unless there's something you'd really like to ask. And then I think you can either, I'm happy, either unmute and interrupt me or give a little wave. And you would think the fact that I was a school principal during COVID would mean that I was really good at that stuff, but I tended to jump online and let my teachers run everything. So I'll do my best. So let me start off by screen sharing and see how that goes and see whether or not people can still see that. So maybe, yep, Grant's giving a thumbs up. Who else can Paul see? Can you see that? Yep, Kerry can see it. So, and the only reason I've called this presentation this really, because it sounds a bit average, I think, but from a middle-aged mum with MS to a mountaineer was when I posted online that I'd be doing this. I put that on a photo. I tend not to think of myself as a middle-aged mum. Probably the reason being that I still feel like I'm about 30 years old. Probably the first sign I got or suggestion I got that I was middle-aged was quite a few years ago teaching, and a student called me middle-aged and I was so offended. But really my sort of motivation behind this...
Why did my brother give me a saucepan lid when I said I was at the bottom?
Oh, someone's just jumped on and needs to mute. We've got a brother talking about a saucepan. So I'm not sure who might need to mute. I can't actually see everyone at the moment. So, but I guess, the notion from middle-aged mum with MS to a mountaineer really is a big part of why I wanted to share my journey, was to pass on a message that I don't bring, any particular skills or talents. I don't bring any particularly, pedigree, athlete, family history. I have a range of unique challenges just like we all do. And I just maybe have quite a strong sense of ambition and dreams that have grown bigger as I've moved towards them. And so, yeah, middle-aged mum with MS to a mountaineer is really just a part of my journey. So one of the things people's sort of asked me about is how did I end up on this pathway? And so on the screen there, you can see a little brooch. And Jeannie, you might remember this, I'm not sure, but this came from Grandpa Ming. And I think I was about 8 when he gave it to me. And there was a picture. So Grandpa Ming was my mum, Kerry, and her sister, Jeannie, my Aunt Jeannie's father. And there was a picture in one of his rooms of a mountain, which I think Mum thought was Mont Blanc, and some books of mountaineers, and probably early stories of Sir Edmund Hillary, and a little brooch. And he gave me that brooch. And, you know, coming from an education background, I sort of think often that what we're doing is we're planting seeds, and then we're finding ways to water those seeds. And I feel like that little brooch was probably something significant in my life. Even though I don't have strong memories, I still have it. I took that photo not that long ago, but it was like a little seed that had been sown. The picture of the little girl holding up the ski poles, I would have been about probably 5 years old then. And once a year we went skiing up to Falls Creek. And in the summer we went up to Thredbo, both ski resorts in Victoria and New South Wales. And I loved being up above the tree line. There's always been something for me that creates an amazing feeling of space when I get up and outside, and I can feel forests are beautiful, but I can feel a little bit closed in. And so I grew up in the Dandenongs and used to like climbing up a big chestnut tree where I could get up there and look over the house. Yeah, so I started, I guess, you know, spending time up in the mountains when I was a little girl. The picture on the bottom right of the screen is, I'm not sure whether it's the right, but it is a picture of me rock climbing, and I was about 22 at that stage. And I went to university and studied outdoor education, and I fell in love with rock climbing and with ski touring, and was spending time in the backcountry. In 1996, I travelled to Nepal, and a big motivator for me for that trip was I got my first job after university and I wasn't really liking it. And these two friends, that's me in the middle with Everest in the background. And these two friends contacted me. One of them contacted me and they were going off travelling. And they sort of said that, you know, half-hearted, oh, you should come. And I took them quite seriously, and I went and quit my job that day. And 2 weeks later, I'd left my job and we were flying off to Nepal. And on that first trip to Nepal, my two friends, Mel and Lisa, wanted to go rafting, and I wasn't comfortable at all being on the water in that way. But I went trekking and I saw a mountain called Mt Everest. And this is the mountain that when I come back to it, or I'm not sure if you can see me, but in my screensaver, my background behind me is Mt Everest. I saw that mountain, and there was a group of Italian mountaineers that had summited, and the celebration they were having was absolutely amazing. And I thought, I want to come back one day. I want to feel whatever it is that they're feeling. The picture of me with the big backpack on, that was last year on a training trip I did up to Mount Kosciuszko, and at one point the pack I was carrying was about 30 kilos. And I think those two pictures on the screen of me climbing and me carrying that pack represent to me probably, you know, my 25-year-old self, young and adventurous and feeling like I could really take on anything. In 2018, I was diagnosed with MS. And about 10 years before that, I'd just had my third child, and I'd had some problems with dizziness, very bad dizziness, and some double vision. And it was suggested that I might have MS. I'd had an MRI and I was living in Colorado. And it was a pretty scary moment for me. The only experience I had had really with seeing someone with MS had been a friend of my mum's who was very unwell. And I imagined that MS, back then when it was first mentioned in 2008, my first sort of thought was, oh gosh, you know, this is something where I'm going to lose so many of my sort of, you know, important capacities, the ones that get me out into the world and that help me adventure and that make me, someone that, you know, had started to, you know, really love that time in the outdoors and identify. And I'd been working as a ski instructor. I'd worked as an outdoor education teacher. I had 3 children. I was living in Colorado. And suddenly I was hit with this reality that all of that might change really suddenly. And my then husband's cousin in Colorado was working alongside some researchers that were researching MS. And I very quickly learnt that there'd been a lot of changes in medications and in treatment protocol. And so it was possible that people were living, I guess, a much more fulfilling life in spite of MS, because a lot of the symptoms were able to be managed. It's still a chronic and it's still a progressive illness, but there's ways of slowing down that progression and there's ways of managing a lot of the symptoms. And so that was in 2008, and learning that there was this progress going into research, that I was perhaps going to receive a diagnosis, I decided then that if ever I got that diagnosis, I wanted to follow what had become quite a strong dream, to learn how to mountaineer. And I decided that at the same time I would want to fundraise for MS research. So in 2018, I did end up getting that actual diagnosis of MS. I went straight onto Facebook and I shared that I had been diagnosed with MS, but not to worry, because it was going to motivate me to follow this dream to learn how to mountaineer. And I was going to find purpose in it by starting to fundraise for MS research. It took quite a few years after that, and it wasn't until last year that I actually headed over to Nepal and had my first go at mountaineering. But I think for me, putting that, I guess, commitment out there, that personal commitment out into a public arena, helped hold me to account. And one of the things that people have asked about sort of this most recent trip of heading to Mount Everest is what has motivated me. And ultimately, it's probably the combination of living with MS and knowing that at the moment I have about 30 lesions in my brain. I don't have any in my spinal cord. If I do get lesions in my spinal cord, then things like my walking and my physical movement might be affected quite quickly. So that's a great motivator to want to climb more and climb quickly. And the other thing, one of the things I have with the MS is my memory is really bad. There was another motivator. Isn't that funny? I've forgotten what that was right now. So I'm sure I'll remember what motivated me shortly. Completely forgot what I was about to say. So at the moment, living with MS for me is very manageable. I rely on medications to help keep my MS at bay. They're pretty unpleasant to take, so I'm a bit slack at that, and I'll be swapping on to new medication once I get back from Nepal. But it's, yeah, an incredible motivator for me to know that I can go and do something right now. I think one of the things that's sort of also sort of become a part of my psyche is this notion that we live our lives often looking up to certain people. And when I look at the mountaineering world, this screen shows just some of the people who I've found sort of quite heroic in things that they've done. Lynn Hill is an incredible rock climber and has made first ascents in Yosemite. Brigitte Muir was the first Australian woman to climb Mount Everest. Most people would have heard of Sir Edmund Hillary. I think just about everyone would have heard of Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person with Tenzing Norgay to summit Everest. Tim McCartney's Snape traveling from sea to summit. Dorothy Butler was a woman called she called herself the Barefoot Bushwalker, and she would walk and climb. She was from New South Wales, right up through most of her life. And Joe Simpson is sort of the storyteller of an epic mountaineering adventure that he moved through. I've read a lot of the stories of these different people, and I've listened to a lot of their documentaries, and I just reached a point where I started thinking, wow, you know, it's amazing these experiences they have. I'd like to actually experience that for myself. I don't want to read the next book. I don't want to watch the next documentary. I want to go out there and see what that life of a mountaineer is like. And so last year, I made that commitment, and with some incredible help from my mum, I had the chance to take some time away from working and to start what I've termed my Climb for a Cure. And I began to train. So I started researching where would I like to climb. I knew that I really wanted to go back and climb Mt Everest. And I knew that it was also one of the harder mountains in the Himalayas to climb. It's about 2,000 meters lower than Everest at the summit, but a lot of the climbing on it is technically harder than the climbing on Everest. And as someone that had ski toured and rock climbed but hadn't mountaineered, it seemed a bit out of reach for me. So I spent a lot of time trying to think about what other mountains I could climb and find other ways to, I guess, scratch the itch that I had that I really wanted to go and climb Mt Everest. In the end, I couldn't manage to do that. So I booked onto an expedition to go and climb Mt Everest. And one of the criteria of that was that I would go and do a basic mountaineering skills course first, and I would climb a peak called Mirror Peak. And so I spent a lot of last year training. I followed a regime from a training program called the Uphill Athlete that does a 24-week mountaineering training course, and that one's for Everest. And I followed that training course, even though it seemed like perhaps it was a bit of overkill for the mountain I'd be doing. Thank God I did follow that, because Mt Everest was incredibly hard. But one of the criteria was that I would do another peak beforehand. So when I'd been in Nepal in my 20s, I had climbed to about 5,500 meters. And having MS now and not knowing how that might impact me at altitude, and before I headed on to Mt Everest, I made a commitment to go and climb a peak called Mirror Peak. And so the photo for me, it's on the top left of my screen, sitting on the snow in a orange and black suit. That's on the summit of Mirror Peak. The second photo along is the Lukla Airport, Tenzing Hillary Airport, which is known as the most dangerous airport in the world. The third photo along is between Lukla Airport and trekking up towards the base camp for Mirror Peak, which was about a 9-day or 10-day trek. And then the fourth photo along, is Mirror Peak itself. Being a trekking peak means that it's not technically difficult. You're up into the snow, you're up to about 6,500 meters, and you're wearing crampons and all of the typical mountaineering gear, and you're in a harness and you're roped together. But there's not any vertical uphill climbing in that way. It turned out to be an incredibly hard peak for me. On the summit night, I couldn't really work out what was going on, but I felt pretty rotten and I sensed it wasn't altitude. And climbing up that night, leaving at about 2 in the morning in the dark with head torches on, all I wanted to do was go to sleep. It turned out that I summited Mirror Peak with COVID. And so that was a pretty huge achievement. I think I became probably not the first person with MS to summit Mirror Peak, but the first person with MS and COVID to summit Mirror Peak. And at that point, I think before I'd gone over, I'd started thinking maybe I'd like to have a go at Everest. When I realised that I'd just climbed 6,500 meters with MS and COVID, perhaps Everest started to seem a little bit more in reach. And the bottom picture just of tents there, I think one of the things that I love is living that lifestyle for an extended period of time of being outside. And I really did fall in love with that expedition lifestyle of waking up every morning in a tent and unzipping your door and feeling like, for me, I was in a Hollywood movie set, just surrounded by the most outstanding, breathtaking mountains imaginable. So after Mirror Peak, I climbed Mirror Peak on an expedition with an Australian leader and about 22 other people. Only 12 of our group summited Mirror Peak. For various reasons, altitude hit a couple, and I think with COVID moving through the group, that made it pretty challenging. I then came back to Lukla with the Australian group, and I farewelled them. And about 6 days later, when I'd had a chance to isolate and then trek a little higher up into the Himalayas, I met a second group. And that was, that was on an Mt Everest expedition led by a British mountaineer called Tim Mosedale. So on the left side of my screen, there's a photo in black with a helmet on, climbing. So the start of any of these trips is technical training, making sure that you have your rope work sorted out. Mirror Peak, we did a little bit of Jumar practicing, and Jumars are the devices you use to help you climb up a rope, but didn't need to use them at all. Mt Everest, we did a little bit of training, and we talked about how important it was to always clip into second ropes and things like that. When we got in onto the mountain, it was a lot harder than any of the training we'd done, which was sort of the opposite to Mirror Peak. And there's just a couple of shots there that show you a little bit more about the steepness of it. One of the things that I found quite entertaining was I didn't realise that I had borrowed a lot of the gear for this trip, and the helmet that I was wearing had the name Jane on it. So I kept wondering why I never quite got called Jen until I realised that it's because I had someone else's name on my helmet, and Jane was close enough I didn't really notice the difference. That bottom photo on the bottom right is perhaps one of the most amazing photos I've ever seen, and I did put that one up just in a little bookshelf in my house. And what I love about that is that photo is of me at about 6,500 meters on one of the hardest climbs there is to climb anywhere. And even when I look at that photo, it's surreal. It doesn't seem like that was actually me and that I was actually able to do something like that. And if I'm being really honest, you know, I'm heading off to Everest going, oh, I don't know if I can do this. And so it's very reassuring to look back at some of these photos and see what it is that I've already done. Another thing that I've really enjoyed that's been helping sort of, I guess, levitate me towards feeling more and more confident that I can have a real go at Everest and that I do have a chance to summit is these couple of photos. So on the left in the orange helmet is Joe Simpson, very renowned mountaineer, and so he was in one of the earlier photos as one of my heroes. He was in a terrible situation where his climbing partner had to cut a rope and cut Joe off that rope, or they were likely both going to not make it out of the mountains. And Joe fell down a crevasse and broke his femur, and he managed to make his way back out and back to base camp and lived to tell his own story. I'm not facing any of those sorts of risks because they were mountaineering, fixing all their own ropes. We climb now on fixed ropes in the trip I'm doing. But that photo next to that of me on the mountain, just to me, I see so many similarities between those two photos, and it's this idea of, you know, becoming sort of my own hero, that I might one day be able to do something remotely like these other people and to look back and go, wow, I honestly really can't quite believe that I've achieved that already. And then that second photo, Brigitte Muir, one of the incredible things about being on this journey for me is I've had a chance to connect with some incredible people that have climbed Everest. So Brigitte Muir, as the first Australian woman, has been there to give me advice as I prepared for my last climb. The photo next to that where I'm on Mt Everest, that suit that I'm wearing belongs to a young woman called Gabby, who has just turned 20, and she summited Everest last year as the youngest Australian to summit Everest. So it was a pretty special thing to have the chance to wear her suit. Gabby climbed Everest with her mum, Jane, and the ultimate in mother-daughter experiences. So I'm very excited that Kerry, Mum, that you're coming along to climb Everest with me this time as well. So I hadn't told you that part. So one of the things that did happen with that beautiful suit of Gabby's in my climb at night was I nicked it with my crampons, and so I was climbing up at night with feathers streaming out absolutely everywhere. And felt a bit like I was a fox that had broken into a chicken coop. Sorry, something's frozen here on my slideshow. Let me just escape there. I might have to. I haven't frozen altogether, have I? Here we go. So one of the reasons, I guess, for going on and climbing these couple of peaks, so Mt Everest, that was my goal. That was my dream, and I decided that I wanted to climb that mountain. And I think one of the reasons I did was my working life had gotten a little bit harder, and living with MS, leading a school, I perhaps didn't feel that my staff team and the people I worked with, I felt like in order to be a really solid school principal, I needed to have the people that were working with me, I needed them to feel like I was invincible, that they could lean on me for anything. And that was quite hard to be able to carry that when I knew that I did have an illness that, even though I was traveling okay, could present, I guess, a level of risk. And sort of I started to feel like perhaps I was a bit of a liability to other people. And setting my sights on climbing in Mt Everest was a chance for me to really, I guess, find my own sense of self-worth. Not that other people were questioning that really, but I think I'd started to question that myself. And I felt like I kept falling a little bit down into the valleys of my own life, and I needed to get my mind together. I needed to get my head together. I needed to learn to stand a bit taller atop my summits and be a bit prouder of who I was. And so this journey to climb Mt Everest was a big part of finding myself. And I didn't actually summit Mt Everest. I made it to about 300 meters from the top of that peak, and my Sherpa got very cold, and he asked if we could turn down. And so that was quite a hard decision. I was moving slowly. I hadn't thought about turning around. On Mirror Peak with COVID, I'd thought about turning around the whole time. On Mt Everest, I didn't actually think about turning around until that question was posed. And he was too cold, and he asked, could I climb faster? And I didn't think I could. And he said, well, if we go any higher, I need to know 100% I can get myself down independently, because he won't be able to help me. And I didn't know that I could. And so I turned around and I came back down. But the summit for me at that time was incredibly metaphorical. I really came down feeling like I had transitioned so much as a person, and found myself again in some ways, found that young woman from her 20s that loved climbing and loved being up in the mountains, and had suddenly followed in the footsteps of some of these heroes. A big part that I'd wanted to do was raise awareness around MS and funds for MS research. And before I went, people wished me luck on my hike. And when I got back, a big question was, how was your hike? And it felt really sort of arrogant to say, well, it wasn't really a hike. It was one of the harder mountains there is to climb. But with that question came the thought, oh, well, how can I do this? And how can I raise awareness? And how can I raise funds and get people to understand the significance and the magnitude of what I'm doing? And I guess I thought, well, I better climb Everest. And so one thing led to another, and I booked onto an Everest expedition. A big question I've been asked is around training for that. And a lot of that has been around having to actually, both before my last trip and between then and now, work on building my own inner resources. The sort of Buddhist saying by a Vietnamese monk who's now passed away, Thich Nhat Hanh, the no mud, no lotus. You know, the lotus is an incredibly beautiful and strong flower, and it relies on the mud to grow in. And in order to really, I guess, you know, blossom and flower ourselves in life, that chance to actually move through the mud and find our way through the mud and allow ourselves to grow. And so some of that training for me has been putting myself into uncomfortable situations. There's a picture there. I went and did a Wim Hof weekend of ice bathing. Swimming out in the surf. I'm not the world's strongest swimmer, and so for me to keep up with other swimmers has been putting on, I look absolutely silly, I'm putting on wetsuits, I'm putting on hand paddles, I'm putting on fins, and I'm waddling out with people that are just in their budgie smugglers, their, you know, little pants or their bikinis or swimsuits, and out I'm going. One of the pictures there, I've got a mask on, and so borrowing an altitude generator that adds nitrogen into the air you're breathing to simulate being higher at altitude, getting on the treadmill with a pack and climbing, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 steps at a time, pushing myself. And I think, you know, there's one photo of me looking pretty unhappy. There's been days when I've woken up and the MS hits me pretty hard as well, and I'm really, really tired, and it's a struggle, and getting out there again as soon as I can and just keeping on going. One of the things I've learned is, you know, a big part of success in the mountains is, you know, 60% what our body can do, 40% what our mind can do. And I think when the going gets tough, our body's trained to be able to just keep on going in a lot of situations, whereas our mind shuts down pretty quickly. So I would say really my focus now, I leave in 10 days, is on just continuing to work with the mind. And as I head over to Nepal and I start the journey, being really present and really aware and managing the ego. You know, I think I said to someone recently, it's the ego. If you're struggling, the ego is the part that pushes people to go for the summit and not make it back down. And so a big part of that journey is checking your ego and knowing that it's not necessary to actually stand on top of Mount Everest to come back with an incredible story. If I don't come back and I push too hard, that story being told by someone else, there's nothing exciting for me in that. So I recorded a video today that I'll share with my children, and it was about my love for life and my love for my children and how important combining those two is, to the point where if at any point, for whatever reason, with the impacts of altitude or anything, I'm just not of a clear mind, that I will turn decision-making straight over to someone else who can think more clearly and ensure safe return down the mountain and safe return home. One of the things as well is that climbing is incredibly expensive. So as well as working to raise money for MS research, I've had to find a way to help fund this climb. And so seeking corporate sponsorship. People said to me, once you get that first sponsor, you'll start to get other sponsors. And I found it really hard to believe that that was actually going to happen, because I wrote and I walked the streets and I spoke to person after person after person trying to get sponsorship. And I told myself, if I can't accept that rejection, I shouldn't be going and climbing Everest, because if I can't actually handle the conversations to look at sponsorship, I'm better off to stay at home. I must confess, very early on, I did get my mum, before I headed to Nepal, I had started thinking about climbing Everest, and I had mum go around and hand some sort of free flyers around to local businesses saying that I was thinking about climbing Everest if I was successful on my climb last year, and would they consider pledging to sponsor me. And thank you so much, Mum, for doing that. I think one company pledged to sponsor me $250, and they followed through on that, but the rest didn't really. And I realised in hindsight that wasn't the best approach, because when I did go back around to some of those businesses, they said, oh, I thought you'd already climbed and your mum had been in. And I thought, but I did get back out my first sort of harebrained idea when I thought, how am I going to do this? I printed out 1,000 flyers, and I thought, right, I'm going to go down to Melbourne, I'm going to hand out 1,000 flyers. That ended with me taking about the last however many hundred and handing them to a lovely couple that I met, two guys that asked what I was doing, and I said, I'm trying to hand out these flyers, it's horrible, I can't believe I did this. And I gave them the rest of them and said, do what you like with them, I just want them all gone. And I moved then to recognizing that it was about writing to larger corporate organizations and actually coming up with a proper sponsorship proposal. I got some amazing support from MS Australia to put some a really lovely proposal together, and as a result I've got a few incredible sponsors. And I realized as well that what people want these days, and you know, financially times are quite challenging, is they would like something in return, that a sponsorship is a commercial arrangement. And so that, for me, the exciting part about that was that I felt like I had a story I wanted to share, and that story was one about a woman living with MS, a middle-aged mum living with MS, heading out to become her own hero and try and make a difference in the world. And these amazing companies, one of the arrangements is that I will then go in and speak to them, and speak to their staff or speak to their customers. And so I'm starting to, you know, line up some of these talks. And so it's given me, I guess, a platform for a larger voice as well. The other thing, and I just need to make a huge, you know, shout out of thanks here, was crowdfunding. And that being, you know, the smaller scale, here's my story, help if you'd like. And soon I will be shifting that focus now onto fundraising just for MS research. As I head off, my commitment was that any money that I receive in assistance, I will continue fundraising and fundraising and fundraising for as long as I need to, until I've paid that forward to MS research as well. This was one of the things I've been doing is listening to a lot of podcasts, and I just thought this was a really interesting thing to just explain a bit more about. You know, I'm heading off in 10 days, and this sense of I'm not ready, I'm going to die, probably is quite real. You know, doubts have a way of creeping into your mind, and my back has been a bit sore lately. My neck's been troubling. I feel undertrained. I feel like my physical fitness isn't as strong as I'd like it to be. My aerobic fitness isn't as strong. One thing I'm really, where I've definitely ticked the goal, is I wanted to put on 5 kilos. I put on those 5 kilos. And so I sort of joke going, I've, you know, met one of those training goals really well. And the others, I've realized, you know, they're still a work in progress. And then I learned that there's certain benefits, that, you know, the idea of sort of that you'll have a peak week, and after that things tend to slow down a bit. You tend to become a bit tired and sore, and that's a time when you need to taper near your trip to manage the anxiety in your brain, and to actually have, you know, the brain's there, you know, protecting all the time. Everest, dangerous, What are you doing? But I think, a nice bit of feedback on that was, we tend to overestimate our control over our fitness, and that we should be able to get really, really strong, and underestimate our control over our mindset. And to realize that actually that mindset, it's with me the whole time. And as long as I carry a mindset, and I love this advice of wonder and curiosity, and I think, I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to do it, I will always be ready enough. And ready enough based on also pretty much a year of training and a couple of peaks in the meantime. But so I head out there with an amazing sense of wonder and curiosity, an unknown adventure that I've learned a lot about, that I have no idea sort of how my story will read once I tell it, once I'm back, but that I'm super excited to be able to do that. And to make a positive difference. And so, again, like I've said, this is all, a lot of it has been about a decision I made years ago to follow that dream, to mountaineer and to fundraise for MS research. On my last climb, with the help of everyone that contributed, almost $10,000 was donated to MS research. And once I get back and I'm continuing to tell my story and hopefully find a line of work speaking and working and motivating other people, and I've done quite a few degrees, I'd like to bring them into play as well in my work and find ways to really make a positive difference and continue through that also to raise awareness for MS. And I guess this, I love some of these, beautiful authors from long ago that had strong connection with nature, and the idea of go confidently in the direction of your dreams and live the life that you've imagined. I think, I've imagined for a very long time that I wanted to become a mountaineer, and I'm so excited that this is my life now. And I want to stop sharing now and come back and
That's in, dogs there.
have a chance now to just see if there's any questions that anyone might have about the journey I'm on. And hopefully I didn't feel like I've just talked at you, but hopefully that answered some of the questions and gave a little bit more insight into who I am and why I'm heading out on this adventure, and why Everest. And if anyone does have any questions, feel free to unmute and shoot a question at me. And if anyone's is wanting to ask any questions, maybe raise your hand as well, just so I can't actually see all your hands because not all cameras are on. So I don't think anyone has any questions.
Jenny, just while people are thinking of their questions, and by the way, you can type them in as well, and I can read them out if you want. I just wanted to say that was an amazing presentation, and I've been following you now. For those, Jenny and I don't really know each other all that well. She's signed up to do a coaching certification that I run, and we're working on that. But I've been following it, and I've just wanted to acknowledge you for the passion that just came through in that presentation, and for like I'm certainly someone who's come from a very low self-worth and self-idea as well, and to see you overcoming that, I'm really looking forward to the books that you'll write, the stages you'll speak on, and the lives that you'll change. So I just wanted to encourage you that you're doing way more than climbing a mountain. And, I say that with all sincerity, because it's just so inspirational to see someone to overcome adversity and just go and do what they said they were going to do. So congratulations.
Grant, thank you. And I guess, that's, those are the sorts of words that I guess I want to hear, really. I went and I gave a talk at a friend's school, Mornington Secondary College, to the year 11s, and they never have people come and talk because the school can't afford people to come and talk. And I had an hour with them, and not looking for, it wasn't paid or anything like that. It was just, I just wanted to go and have a chat. And I shared a lot more then about some of my challenges through schooling and some of my other challenges. And yeah, it was really nice to get that sense that the stories that we share of our challenges in life, and people that have been following my posts, I sort of warn that this is a very real and raw post. the feedback I've been given as people read those has been, yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you for allowing space for people to become a bit more vulnerable. And I think one of the sort of motivators in my life was having to, I guess, look myself in the mirror and think, what are some of my fears as a woman with MS, and fears around, could I live a healthy life? Could I live a long life? Could I support myself? Could I support my children? What might all of that look like? And I had to make some big life changes, and I, end a marriage that wasn't working for me and things like that. And at the end of the day, it's encouraging other people to go, well, we all have fears and we can all face up to them and, yeah, find our own real and metaphorical summits. So thank you.
No problem. So we've had Elle, and that's I'm not sure who Elle is. Ask if you're still recording. So that could be why people are not wanting to ask questions. That's fine. But they also go on to say you are a great inspiration to those who have faced adversity and face adversity. There are a lot of hidden people out there, just like Jen, with masks. Congratulations on taking off your mask.
Well, thank you very much. That's a beautiful
Jen,
thing to say.
Excellent presentation, Jen. That was wonderful to listen to, and all that Grant said, I can totally underline everything he said.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. Thank you.
Yeah, I congratulate you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, bye for now.
Okay, bye, Jenny. And I can't see other questions popping up. So if people do want to, thank you so much for coming and joining in this room. And Grant, thank you so much for jumping on and helping me. You're like a Sherpa of the Zoom world. So if I needed a bit of oxygen, you were carrying it there for me. So thank you. Yeah, if anyone does want to stay on, I will stop recording. Just if anyone wants to